It's lesson 4 of our series on rhetoric.
Let's do it.
These are my promises. 1, I'll tell you what I'm going to tell you. 2, I'll tell you. 3, I'll tell you what I told you. I hope this structure helps. I promise you, I promise. Coming up! Here's what's coming up in lesson 4. We're going to take a deeper dive into Aristotle's rhetorical / persuasive appeals of logos, pathos, and ethos. First, we'll do a quick overview of all 3 appeals. Then we'll talk about Aristotle on logos, the appeals to reason. We'll talk about Aristotle on pathos next. Those are the appeals to emotion. And then we'll talk about Aristotle on ethos, the appeals to credibility or the character of the speaker. We'll also be giving examples of all 3 of them. Here we go.
Here we go! I promise you, I promise. I'll tell you all about it.
Here's a quick overview of Aristotle's rhetorical appeals, logos, pathos, and ethos. He actually moves in one section of the rhetoric in opposite order and goes ethos, pathos, logos. That's called chiasmus when you rearrange parts of a discourse.
That's our secret word for the day.
There's some really cool information on chiasmus on Wikipedia, including a section on how it's rhetorically effective. So check that out if you're interested. Back to our lesson. Like at the sentence level, a stylistic chiasmus would be like, people are at their best when they're happy and they're at their happiest when they're at their best, maybe, or something like that. But he's doing it at a more macro level with sections of the discourse. So anyway, I'll proceed in his order just for this part because this is the alternative order, and then I'm going to go back to how I have it in the title, logos, pathos, ethos. So let's go backwards. This will be good for our brains. So let's look at his first one as it's represented here, the character of the speaker, or ethos. Then there is when you appeal to someone's emotions, the audience's emotions, that is pathos. And the third one, when you actually make logical arguments in the speech itself or in the piece of writing itself, when you try to either establish truth or likelihood, that's called logos. So that's the quick overview. If you want to know more about this, you can go back to previous videos and check it out.
Rhetoric.
Logic.
Perfectly logical.
I promised you examples, and trust me, they're coming. But first, I want to just talk about each appeal on its own in the way that Aristotle describes it in the rhetoric, and then we can get into like what it looks like. So about logos or logic, the appeal to logic or reason, Aristotle says that it's affected to the speech itself when we've proved a truth or apparent truth. Truth would be something like, provable. Apparent truth would be something that is, more on the likely side of things. A statement's persuasive and credible because it's self-evident or because it appears to be proved from other statements. Sometimes we make a series of syllogisms or statements and then they make the conclusion true. Like, all men are mortal. Dr. C is a man. Therefore, Dr. C is mortal, right? That would be proving something, a truth, from statements that are also true. But you can also do that same thing with things that are not a slam dunk in terms of truth. Truth, but that are more of a likelihood issue.
Such a strong case.
Like, the sun will probably come up at 7:35 a.m. tomorrow, and people will say, why? And you will provide all sorts of
data from the last several years or hundreds of years about when the sun sets at this time of year. I can't remember. Did I say set or rise? It doesn't matter. Whatever it is, sure, there might be a tiny fluctuation because of the calendar or something, but you can establish probability. Aristotle says about making logical appeals, if some premises are true, then something else, the conclusion, beyond them results, either universally or for the most part. Same thing I was just talking about a second ago. That idea of truth.
And that's the truth.
Or likelihood.
The most beautiful dunker of the basketball, Vince Carter, Michael Jordan, Sean Kemp, Steve Francis, and this guy.
Right? In practical reasoning or practical logic, critical thinking, sorts of thing, we say that universal truth is deduction. If you have true premises, the conclusion must follow and must be true.
If it's a valid or sound argument.
If things are just kind of likely to be the case from the statements that you're stacking together to form a conclusion, then that would be induction, because some of the premises might be likely, leading to a likely conclusion. So let's take a look at what this might look like, an appeal to logos or logic.
An example today.
With all of the appeals, I'll be giving examples first that are a little more serious than the sillier ones that follow. So let's start with logos, some examples. Aristotle talks about, and I just talked about it in the video, establishing a truth or an apparent truth. And what he means is by truth is something, that is that slam dunk, right? It's either true or false. And so the first example here is a truth. This is deduction, where it's, first of all, it doesn't happen much in the real world. This usually happens a lot in like critical thinking class or practical reasoning class. But here's an example. First statement, all professors are human. The second statement, Dr. C is a professor. And then finally they arrive at a conclusion. So Dr. C is human. Now, if these premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true. If we look at the next example, this is what Aristotle would call an apparent truth, and we call this induction. This aims at likelihood, and this is much more common than actual deduction in our everyday conversational lives. So the second example, almost all people have belly buttons. Dr. C is a person, so Dr. C likely has a belly button. Now, this is probably a pretty strong argument. However, it is not universally true for every human being. So it is possible that Dr. C might not indeed have a belly button. So that'd be an apparent truth. Now let's look at a different kind of example.
An example today.
I'm running for mayor. You should vote for me. Why? I'm glad you've asked. Let me run out to the trunk of my car and gather the boxes of unimpeachable data proving that my 5-point plan.
Revitalize our downtown region will bring in a 200% increase in tax revenue while boosting our 3 decades spending economy.
Just keep moving. Don't make eye contact.
Oh God, I'm running. Ah, yeah. Rhetoric. Emotion.
You'll see from the first item up here that Aristotle places appeals to pathos inside the audience. Persuasion may come through the hearers when the speech stirs their emotions. Our judgments when we are pleased and friendly are not the same as when we are pained and hostile. He also says, this is actually my wording. I just I couldn't find a good quote that kind of summed this, so I wanted to just kind of nutshell it for you. By understanding why a person feels a certain emotion, Aristotle says, and in what circumstances they feel that emotion, we can observe the ways that emotion can be used in persuasion. So if we know what makes people angry, right? And we know when, and we know at whom, and we know in what situations, then we probably know how to make them angry using language or other communicative strategies. We can also use that to imagine how someone might be using emotional appeals on others or on us. So that's the observational analytical power of rhetoric. Some of the emotions that Aristotle explores in the rhetoric: anger, hate, shame, calmness, fear, pity, friendliness, confidence, envy. All of these things come from this source here, Kennedy. And Kennedy, the translator, who's a classicist, studies the classics, ancient Greek and Roman literature, philosophy, culture, history. He even goes so far as to say that the rhetoric offers the first systematic treatment of human psychology. So this is an important work. This is really the first time someone has laid out a psychology in this, really ideal sort of systematic, both logical and example-driven treatments of human emotions and the way humans think.
An example today.
Here's my less silly version of examples of appeals to pathos. Aristotle in the Rhetoric arranges the lists of emotions as negative positive pairs. Like he has anger and calm, fear and confidence. It's in line with his entire philosophy. If we look at some of the negative ones, this is what I separated it. So negative example, let's pretend we have a preacher, a Christian preacher, some denomination. And if and when this preacher ever says something like an angry God, the wrath of God, or that we should fear Jesus, or that we'll be punished by hell, well, that same person in the same sermon, if it's rhetorically persuasive, right? If it suits his rhetorical purpose, might also use positive emotions, like instead of angry God on the top first example, we have a merciful God. Instead of wrath of God on the one on the right, the top, we have on the bottom God's grace. Same with instead of fear Jesus, we have a brother Jesus, our brother. And you might be punished in hell, you'll be rewarded in heaven. I'm not saying anything negative or positive about what the preacher's saying. I don't have a dog in that fight. It's just that if a preacher's rhetorical intent is to save someone's soul, then they're going to use any persuasive means they can to try to help that person, if that's what they believe they're doing. All right, let's look at a different kind of example.
An example today.
I'm running for mayor. You should vote for me. Why? If I'm not elected, this town will turn into a hellhole.
No, I don't want this.
Rhetoric. Credibility.
If appeals to logos or logic appear or located, within the text, the statements, the arguments, and if pathos exists within the audience in terms of how persuasion is happening. Ethos is all about the speaker or the writer, the person delivering the message. So let's take a look at this. Aristotle says that persuasion is achieved by the speaker's personal character. when the speech is so spoken as to make us think him credible.
Oh my God!
Credibility. We believe good men.
Seriously?
Oh, please.
Sorry about that. Good people
Ah, that's better.
more fully and more readily than others. We want to make sure the person's trustworthy. And this might vary by audience. Trustworthiness is not always the same across the board. And if you're in a biker bar and you want to appear trustworthy and credible, you might use different rhetorical strategies than you might use if you're speaking to a group of nuns.
Welcome to Broad Sweeping Generalizations. Your host, Daniel J. Cleary.
The next bullet is that it's persuasive for the speaker to construct a view of himself as a certain kind of person. In Aristotle's Art of Rhetoric, he doesn't consider things that are outside of the discourse, the speech, the piece of writing, the communication. Those things are not artistic. If you are banking on your pre-existing status, that's not really an artistic persuasion strategy. So he talks about constructing a view within the actual speech or piece of writing or whatever it is that you're doing that makes you look credible, that makes you look trustworthy, makes you look virtuous in the way that that audience views virtuous people. This is big.
Attention.
Aristotle says character may almost be called the most effective means of persuasion. It's often about the speaker, not about the message. So let's remember that when we get to the separate lesson on ethos. So let's look at what an appeal to ethos might look like.
Credibility. An example today.
Moving on to our more serious example of ethos or credibility. Aristotle in the Rhetoric says that the speaker should make us think they're credible, and they should construct a view of themselves as a certain kind of person. And this has to happen within the art. So if you see my first bullet, is if somebody's coasting on their pre-existing status, if everybody knows who this person is, they're already an established authority on something, or maybe by dint of their job, they happen to have authority. Well, getting by on just who everyone knows you are wouldn't really be artistic and part of the art of rhetoric for Aristotle. It would be a less extreme example of somebody, using a sword to persuade. It's persuasive, but it's not really part of the art of rhetoric. So when we talk about, what's in the art, we say the second bullet, what's created in the speech, in the art, in the communicative act. So in some examples, whenever somebody says something like, I'm the kind of person, or I'm not the kind of person who, you know that they're starting an example of, an appeal to ethos or their credibility or their own character. An example I just wrote, but it sounds like it could be real. The second one, when I was our nation's Secretary of State, I took a solemn oath to defend our Constitution, and I will take that same commitment to the Oval Office. Now, that's definitely an appeal to ethos or credibility, character. So let's look at some different kinds of examples of appeals to ethos.
Credibility. An example today.
I'm running for mayor. You should vote for me. Why? Well, my experience serving as a chaplain in the Marine Corps has proven my leadership skills.
You had me at chaplain.
Yeah! Rhetoric. I promise you, I promise. One more time.
Here's what we covered. We did a quick overview of all three appeals. Then we talked about them individually: logos, pathos, and ethos. And we went over some examples for each of them. Thanks for stopping by. And be on the lookout for more Dr. C 411 Lo-Fi lessons.
What's the 411, huh?